Today's daf is daf Ayin Vav, the last daf in the Masechet, and we're going to start from Tanu Rabbanan on Ayin Hey Amid Beis. So if we count up from the bottom, or actually it's a little easy to count up from the wide lines, it's the third of the wide lines. Tanu Rabbanan. This starts a new sugya. Halokeach kli klei tashmish min ha'oved kochavim. So he buys utensils that are used for food from the goyim. So that means either the goy manufactured the kli or he acquired ownership of the kli and then he sells it to you or gives it to you. Is dvarim shelo nishtamish bahem. If the goy has never used them, so therefore there's no blias isur. Therefore, matbilan vehem tahorim. All you have to do is take them to the mikveh, bitovel. It's a mikveh 40 saw, and then you could use the kli. If it was a kli like a cup or so that's only used for cold, and therefore there's very limited, if any, bli at all, kigon kosos uktonios utsluchios, cups, wine, drink dippers, flasks, is madichan, all he has to do is wash them out, matbilon, he has to take them to the mikveh, vein tahorim, and then you're allowed to use them. Dvarim shenishtamish ben alidei chamin, if they were used like cooking utensils over hot water, kigon ayoros vakumkumun v'machame umachame chamin. So you have pots and kettles and urns. Is magiilon? He does hagola. That means he dips this small pot or kettle into a larger pot that's boiling water. Matbilan, he takes them to the mikveh vein tahorim. Dvarim shenishtamish ben al yidei, or if it was used with fire, kigon ha shapudin va'askalos, spits and grills, milabnon. Then he has to do libun. He has to burn out the blia, umatbilan, and then he does tefillah vehein tahorim, and then the tar. Now let's just notice a few things over here. First of all, notice that what's called hechsher kelim, which is the hadacha or the hagola or the libun to take out the blia, all that has to happen first in the sequence, and then afterwards he takes him to the mikveh. And there's a gigantic controversy amongst the Rishonim. What happens if he reversed the order and he first took him to the mikveh before taking the blia out and doing the hechsher kelim? So he did tefillas kelim first and then hechsher kelim. Many Rishonim seems to say that b'diavad it's okay. L'chatchili should have done it in a certain sequence. And other Rishonim go as far as to say that it's like tovel v'sheretz biyodo. Guy's going to a mikveh and he's holding on to a sheretz, then the tefillah in the mikveh is not going to be mitayar him. And therefore, even b'diavad in that sheet of Rishonim, he has not fulfilled the mitzvah of tefillah, and he has to take the kelim to the mikveh. Now, what happens if he uses the kelim without taking them to the mikveh? Is the Gemara says kulam shenishtamish ben ad shelo yatbil, if he used these utensils before he went to the mikveh with them, is then v'shelo yagil v'shelo yilaben, or before he used them before hagola and libun, is tani chada osa v'tani idach muta. According to one brisa, you're not allowed to eat the food, and the reason for that in the case of ad shelo yagil would be, for ad shelo yilaben, would be because the blia of the Easter is polate, and it's spit forth into the food. So the food now has a blias Easter, and that's a principle called ta'am ki ikar. V'tanya either, but a different brisa says muta. So the question is, can we reconcile these two brisos? Lo kash, Gemara says we can. Ha kiman diyomer nosin tam lefkam osur, ve'ha kiman diyomer nosin tam lefkam muter. In other words, when the kli was bolea isur, then if it sits overnight, according to Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, or alternatively, according to other Rishonim, if it stays until the next morning and evening, meaning a full 24 hours, then it becomes a tam pogum, And if you hold nosin tam lifgam is mutter, then the food is mutter. And that seems to be the shita that was accepted la'aloch, that nosin tam lifgam is mutter. However, there's a shita of Rabbi Meir that we had a little earlier in the Masechta that nosin tam lifgam is osir. According to him, then, b'di'eved, if you use the kli over hot water, boiling water, and it hadn't had tefillah, hagala or libun, then the food is osir because nosin tam lifgam is osir. So the Gemara says the following: Uleman diom nosin tam lifgam muter ki ule ovde kom diom rachmona heichi mishkachas. I don't get it. In the Melchemes Midjan, we took booty and we captured the kalim of the Midjanites, and there the Torah says that we have to take them to be magil them or to be malabing them to get rid of the blias isa. Why? It's always going to be no saint tam livgam, because presumably the Midjanim didn't use that kli within the last 24 hours. Amar Abchia Breda of Huna lo asr Torah el kedera bas yoma. We're now starting today's daf, and that means that the Torah, when it required hagala libun, only referred to those kalim, like let's say, for example, when they came in and they saw, next to the fireplace, they saw there were kalim that were left by the Midjanim, then they knew that it was used very recently. But if it was the average keli, which we have every reason to assume that it wasn't used within the last half a day or a day, is then it's no sintam lifgam and it's mutter, and therefore the Torah never required hagala or libun. To lav no sintam lifgam. If we know that it was used just recently, then the tam is a tam l'shvach, not a tam l'fgam. Hence, the Torah requires either hagala or libun. So the Gemara objects and says, "Wait a minute, we can't v'elech lishteri. Why then do we have to do hagala and libun if the kli was used for Isa? Why not just wait overnight and fight the Gnesek, and then it's fine?" And the Gemara says, "Gzera kedera she'ena bas yoma." Mishum kedera bas yom. If we allow you to eat from a kedera that has a blia from yesterday, based on the principle of nosin tam l'fgam mutter, then you're going to go ahead and confuse it even with a kli that's a bas yoma that was used within the last short period of time. So it comes out that our hagol and libun in 99.9% of the cases is all just a gzera otu a kli shehi bas yoma ve'idach. And let's say, according to the Mandi Omer that holds that nosin tam lifgam is asur, kedera bas yoma nami mifgam pogma, he's going to derive the conclusion that even if the kedera was used recently, it's included in the requirement of hagala, because despite the fact that the tam is already a tam pogum, the very fact that the tam was absorbed into the walls of the kli and now it spits it forth, that makes it into a tam pogum, a detrimental tam. And yet the Torah requires hagala and libun. So it means the Torah is not differentiating between tam l'shvach and tam l'fgam, and it's always awesome. Rami lei Rav Amram Rav Ashi. Rav Amram raised an objection in front of Rav Sheshes. Now we learned in our Mishnah here, Ha Shapudim va'askala melabnom bi'or. So these are spits and grills that are used over the fire, and presumably they were used for a treif and a velut. So therefore you have to be melabing them. For Tanan Gabi Kodshman, yet we have a Mishnah in Zvachim that seems to say the opposite. Now, let's understand. Hashpud v'askala magilim bechamin. With regard to kodshim, what happens is that if the kodshim are bolea, then that blia becomes nosar after the time that's allotted. Let's say in the case of Shalom, 2 days. Case of chatos, it would be 1 day. And after that time period passes, then that carbon becomes nosar, which is an Isur kares. Now, I would think that if you used in the process of of broiling, the basar of shlomim or chatos, a shpud or an askala, then you should require libun because the blia is a blias eish through fire, and therefore Kabbalah it requires a hechsher through libun. Why does it say in the Mishnah that it's sufficient to do agola? Omale Amram Bri. So Rav Sheshes responds to Rav Amram's question, he calls him my son. Ma inyan kodshim etzel gilu of the chum hasam eter bala hacha isura bala. Now, this distinction is one of the most fundamental distinctions in the laws of Tarovis, and that is that in most cases, at the time of the Blia was a Blias Isur. Like, let's say, for example, you cooked nevela or treifa, that's Blias Isur. But in the case of Kodshim, at the time of the Blia was Heter. It was before it came Nosa. Nosa was only after the allotted time passes. And with regard to a Blia of Heter Bola, all we need is Hagol. And this will be very relevant according to many Rishonim with regard to Chametz and a Kli that absorbed Chametz, and whether you want to be Machshavit and Mitarit for Pesach. That's also a Terabola because at the time you used it for Chametz, it was Mutter. Omar Rava, Sof Kika Polit, Isura Ka Polit. Rava doesn't understand the logic behind the fact that it was Heterabola. Right now, after a day, or in the case of Shlomo, after 2 days, the Blia itself is a Blias Isur, became Nosar. And now you're cooking in a pot with a Blias Isur with those kalim that we used in the Beis HaMikdash for Karbanos. So right now, the Blia is Isura. The fact that historically yesterday it was Blias Heter, why should that be relevant? And since the Gemara doesn't get rid of Rava, it sounds like Rava gets rid of this distinction between Heter Bol. So many poskim hold that Heter Bol has the same identical Isur as Isura Bol. Ela Amar Rava, Mai Hagolanami Shtifa Umarika. So Rava suggests that with regard to the Mishnah in Kodshim, when it refers to Hagola, it doesn't refer to Hagola exactly, but we'll take the word Hagola in a little bit more of a general sense, kind of an abstract sense, and it's referring to Shtika Umarika. Now, Shtika, Shtifa means rinsing, and Marika means to rub it in a very profound way. So according to Rava, when the Mishnah Zvachim requires Hagola, it's not referring to the typical Hagola, but rather to scouring and rinsing, Shtifa Umarika. And this is mandated by the Torah in Vayikra Perek Vav for a utensil that was used for Kodshim. So the Mishnah in Zvachim, in opposition to our Mishnah, holds that you can remove the tam that was absorbed through fire with marika and shtifa alone. Now, could it be that the Mishnah Zvachim rejects the principle of Kibolo Kachpolto? The Blia was over the fire, and now we're going to get rid of that Blia through scouring it and washing it, rinsing it. How could that be? So Rashi suggests here that maybe what Rava means is that the Mishnah Zvachim agrees fundamentally that if the absorption of the Blia was with fire and there was no liquid, then Enoch Hinami, you would need Libun. However, there's a Gzeras HaKosuv that after you do the libun, that's not sufficient in kodshim. And when the Mishnah in kodshim in Zvachim says you need shtifa umarika, it means after the libun. And even though the libun itself should be absolutely effective to remove any blias isa, there's exeris akasu, and the Torah requires that with regard to the migdash, we have to be more machmir, and we have to add to libun on the tail or following libun, marika ushtifa. Amalei Abaye says midami. Abaye objects to Rava, and he says the following. It doesn't make sense that the Mishnah in Zvachim would use the word marika or the word shtifa to refer to libun. Libun is burning fire. Marika and shtifa is bitzone. You rinse something off in cold water. And hagola, on the other hand, if the Mishnah is using the word hagola, it's referring to chamin, to boiling water. You do hagola in boiling water. And if the Mishnah in Zvachim says that all you do with the kli of kodshim is put them into hagola, then apparently it doesn't require libun. And we're back to square one with our original kasha. Ela Amar Abaye, Abaye says we have to offer a different solution to this question, and that is Yagid Olav Rail. Right? Sometimes the Tana will only write down, the requirements that are only partial, and then he'll rely on other Mishnayos to fill in the missing gaps. So you have to see two Mishnayos and put them all together. Tana Hacha Libun, for who adin la Gola, Tana Hasam Agola, for who adin Lilibun. So here, with regard to Gi'ule Akum, that means Kalim that would take it from Goyim, then you need Libun, but you also require Hagola. Now, the question is, why would you require Hagola if you did Libun? And the Tana there in Kodshim mentions only Hagola, but you really require Libun as well. But if you're going to do Libun, why do you need Hagola? So it comes out that according to Abaye, in the cases of both Kodshim and Gi'ule Akum, you require both Hagola and Libun. And the Marika and Shtifa is a special din as an add-on to Kodshim, even after Libun and Hagola. Now, what is the logic of Abaye? You require Hagola, and you're talking about a shpud. I don't get it. The belia of the shpud was with fire, and then you did libun. Why do you need Hagola? So I can't really answer that question, but I could just say that somehow Abaye holds that what libun accomplishes is not enough, and you need something else, which is Hagola. What Hagola accomplishes is not sufficient. You need something else called Libun. Amalei Rava, Ihachi, if I accept your premise, then Lisninu Lekulu Bechada. Why did the Tana teach us both Hagol and Libun in both Mishnayos? Or, alternatively, let the Tana teach me both Hagol and Libun at least in one of the two Mishnayos, and then by equation and analogy, I'll learn the other one. Lisnei Chada Be'idach Achriti, V'lema Yagid Olav Real. Now, why is it that one Mishnah mentions Hagola, another mentions Libun, and now you're putting them both together? Why doesn't one Mishnah mention both Hagol and Libun, and the other Mishnah doesn't have to mention anything, and we'll apply the principle of Yagid al Avreo, and we'll learn one Mishnah by equation to the other Mishnah. El Amarava Kodshim Hainu Taima Killer of Nachman Omar Rabba Varvo Kol Yom Vyom Nasa Gil Lechaver. Okay, let's try to understand this new principle, which the Gemara applies to Kodshim and specifically to Kodshim. Let's say, for example, on Sunday they brought a carbon shlom in a certain kli. Then on Monday they use the same kli for shlom, a second carbon. So the second carbon now receives the blia from the first carbon, and the first blia is no longer. It doesn't exist anymore because whatever was nivla on Sunday is now polate on Monday when they use the kli for a second carbon. Again, it's going to get very complicated if on Sunday they brought a carbon shlomim and on Monday a carbon chatas, or the reverse, because a chatas only lasts for one day and then it becomes nosar. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, I don't understand Rav. Tenach shlomim, the kaven del shnei yomim misachli, you could eat it for 2 days. Mekami denevi nosar kahavi gil. When he uses it the second time, on the second day, meaning on Monday, that's called like a giul to get rid of the blia of Sunday. And everything is mutter because the shlom could be eaten for 2 days. El achatas, but regard to achatas, you're in trouble. Keva del yom v'layla misaklo, all you have is 1 day to eat the karvachatas. Ki mevashel ba ha'idna chatas havi nosar. Right? If you cook a chatas on Sunday, in one kli, in a kli, and then you use the same kli on Monday, by Monday, the blia of the first kli is nosar. Mi hadam v'ashel be'lemachar. Is he allowed to use the same kli tomorrow for shlomim or chatas? It makes no difference because what's going to happen is the kli is going to be polate nosar. Ki hadam v'ashel be'lemachar o shlomim o chatas. Either way, kapolit nosar de chatos ha'idna. Meaning today, on the second day, the blia of yesterday is already nosar. Or b'chatos u'shlamim de l'machar. Right? Or let's say on Sunday he cooked in this kli chatos, and then on Monday when he cooks this kli shlamim, then the chatos is already nosar. Lo tzricha, the Gemara responds that's saying the following: Amri lo tzricha. Dechi mevashel bechatos ha'idna. So on Sunday he cooked in this kli a karba chatos. Hadar mevashel ba ha'idna shlamim. The chatos de l'machar u'shlamim di esmo. Mahadi adodi kasholim zmane. V'hadar mevashel shlam de l'machar. So when he cooks chatos in this kli, then he'll cook shlamim within that same time period. And by following the cooking of chatos with the cooking of shlamim, then any tam that was absorbed from the chatos is now polate into the shlamim. Now, in order to appreciate this and how this works, so we have to know something about Zro l'chayim v'keva, meaning that in the case of shlamim, the bailim are allowed to eat the basa, but there's certain parts of the basa that have to go to the kohanim, and that's called Zro l'chayim v'keva. So Rashi says over here that on that same day that he cooks the chatos in the kli, he goes ahead and he cooks zrol chayim v'keva. Now, a chatos is eaten by a kohen, so that if there's a plate of the chatos flavor in the zrola chayim v'keva, it doesn't matter, because in any event it's going to go to the kohen, because that's the din of zrola chayim v'keva. If, on the other hand, you would cook in that same pot of chatos the other parts of the basar shlom, you have a real problem, because then the time of chatos goes into the basar, and the Zara, the non-kohen, is not allowed to eat that basar. So this is called Bahari Adodi Kosholim Zmane V'Hodim Mevashel Shlom Dilamocha. So basically, both will reach the limit of time that's allotted for it at the same time simultaneously. So So again, we go back to square one, because if you're telling me that whatever was absorbed by the chatos is now niflat when he cooks the shlomim subsequent to the chatos, then why does he require any hechsher at all? The Mishnah says he requires hangola. Kash. So Rava ends up with a kash. Rav Papa Amar, another solution, high korid v'high low korid. It seems that according to Rav Papa, there's a fundamental difference between gi'ulei nachrim, the blia from the cooking of the nachrim. The nachrim will cook from time to time; they won't cook constantly, as opposed to the blia of kodshim, when the utensil's in constant use. And that's called, in the lashon of the Gemara, high-low korid, meaning the blia doesn't have enough time to get hard, because he's following in kodshim one blia after the other. It doesn't congeal, and therefore hagol is sufficient. Rav Ashi Amar, another answer. So Rav rejected that distinction, and now Rav Ashi brings it back to life. Uda kashalach, and you, Rava, had the following question to be idna de kapolit isura kapolit, even though originally at the time of the cooking the blia was a blias heter, but now at the time of the plata, when you cook the second time around, it's already a blias isur. It became nosar. To be idna de kapolit isura kapolit, be idna de kapolit lo isa lisur be'ene. So when the pot was used for cooking kodshim, and now it's polate, it is polate isura, because by now the blia has become nosar. However, this is not difficult, because what do we want to aser? We want to prohibit that blia when it goes into the cooking, but at that point, it's not really mamoshes. I mean, there's no real nosar here. There's only a tam of nosar. There's no be'en of nosar. So what it means is that the Isser has to be chal when it's bolua, in the state of blia, when it's not be'en. And that's what a terbola means. So even though an Isser bolua is different than a be'en, but if you cook that be'en and it was also at the time that you cooked it, then the blia is also. But if, on the other hand, at the time that you cooked in it, it was a bli of heter, then that bli of heter cannot convert into an iser because there's no mamash, there's no be'en. But kama malabon, how far do I have to go with this libun? How long do I have to keep it under the fire? Omar Rabbi Moni ad shetosher kliposim, that there are layers on the outside of the kli that will actually fall by, and they'll be removed by the heat of the libun. Ketzam agilon, Omar Rav Huna yorek tana b'tok yorek gedola. Very good. You have a large pot. You put the pot that smaller pot that needs hagol, and you put it into the larger pot, affecting Gemara. Yorek gedola. But what do you do if the B'li of Isa was in a Yoreh Gedola? You don't have a larger Kli to put this Yoreh Gedola into. It's the largest Kli that you own. I used to do Hechsher Kalim on an annual basis in the army as part of my Miluim. And I remember there were Kalim that was so large, you can't even imagine. There's nothing larger than them that you could put it into. Is Tashma, the answer to your question, we're going to derive from a story, Dahu Duda to avoid Beirav Akavya, right? There was a certain dud. The dud is a large pot, and it was in the house of Rav Akavya, and it needed Agola. A haderle, he puts around this large pot, and here we turn to Amid Beis,